Hello, we're going to review the first part of bureaucracy. This is the portion that you're going to have the test with on the presidency. If you've gone to the website, I need you to print the bureaucracy PowerPoint. If you don't want to print it and just follow along, that's fine too. You can have this as an audio recording. I'm going to do it as a screencast so you can see it as I move along. So this portion is going to take about 10 minutes and we're going to go over the history and definition of bureaucracy. This portion of bureaucracy falls under the executive branch. Remember, the president executes the law, and he needs help to do that. And anybody who works under the executive branch is part of the bureaucracy. If you see the definition, it's very easy to remember. It's just like a bureau of a dresser where you categorize and you administer. So it's an administrative system. Carries out policy created by the legislative branch, but it's the day-to-day functioning of the federal government. They use standardized procedures to carry out the law. It has a definite hierarchy. There's always somebody in charge, and they trickle down the jobs until it finally gets to us, the citizen, and they usually base it on a specialization of duties. Anytime you see the definition of bureaucracy, it's easy to think about an administrative system that has a definite hierarchy that establishes policies that we carry out day to day. Some people refer to the media as the fourth branch, but you might also hear the bureaucracy considered the fourth branch. Remember, politicians come and go, but the bureaucracy, the federal workers who work day in and day out to make sure that law and policy are carried out, work for the government. So they are there, sometimes lifelong, in the civil branch of government. So sometimes that's nicknamed the fourth branch of government. All power, again, is derived from Article 2. Please don't forget that. The executive branch is Article 2. The legislative branch is Article 1. Legislative makes law. Executive carries out or executes the law. So we are going to look at why the bureaucracy has evolved since the beginning of the United States. We're going to quickly go over those and some historical aspects of it. Before we do that, look at the purpose of the bureaucracy. Right here it states the purpose is to implement or carry out public policy. We've talked about how policy is a law. This sentence says, tasks vary according to laws passed by Congress and the agencies involved. For example, the social service agencies perform different tasks from the Postal Service or an agency regulating the market or our defense system. A great example is to look at President Obama's healthcare system. The law was created, remember, it had thousands of pages in it, and they give that to the executive branch under Secretary of Health and Human Services, and it's her job to administer that law. So they have to take it and digest it and break the law apart to see what has to be done and what agencies have to oversee that law. So the purpose of bureaucracy is to implement it. It is a huge, massive job because sometimes Congress is vague in their language, which will lead to different powers like quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, and I'll explain that a little later. Here are some words you might see this regarding the bureaucracy. This states, historically, controversy has always surrounded the bureaucracy. Some consider it, and by some, you could talk about experts, you could talk about citizens, but some think it's evil because it involves anonymous individuals who make broad policy decisions. If Congress is vague about something, it's up to the bureaucracy to define it, and sometimes that gives the bureaucrats a lot of power. And so that's one criticism. Another criticism of the bureaucracy, many say it's too cumbersome, it's unsuccessful because they don't carry out the original intent of the law. Oftentimes it's wasteful, and you might have heard of this term before, but some could say it is red tape. And red tape just means that you have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to accomplish it. A great example would be going to the License Bureau. Sometimes you have to, if you want to get your driver's license, you have to show that you have passed a test. You might have to have a personal property statement if you want to register your vehicle in order to get it tagged. There's a lot of different steps, and if you don't have one document in line, then you cannot get your car registered or you can't get a license. Another thing that you might think about is if you've ever traveled overseas or if you are hoping to someday, you have to apply for a visa in order to travel to another country, and you have to have a U.S. passport. And sometimes it takes months to get your U.S. passport. Sometimes a visa is denied, and that's just all part of the red tape, that there are certain people saying that you have not met the requirements, and therefore it's preventing you or detaining you from doing something. Some opponents of bureaucracy want a devolution of government programs. Now, I want you to circle and understand this word. The opposite of devolution is to evolve or to grow. So if you ever see devolution of power, we talked about this before in the issue of federalism. When you devolve or when you have devolution of power, you are transferring power from the national government to the state governments. So when you have that devolution, anytime you see that, many people, citizens in states who are for state rights, say Washington, D.C., and our federal legislative and executive branches have too much power, and they want to give more power to the states. An excellent example of that was when we had welfare reform in 1996 under President Clinton. And President Clinton chose to give back some of the decision-making power to state governments, and that made state writers very happy. Others argue for privatization of certain government agencies. We have done that in Missouri, actually, with the Driver's License Bureau. It's no longer operated by the state. They have contracted that out, and I believe Monte's firm currently runs our license bureau for when you guys go get your driver's license and things of that nature. Other areas that might have privatization, and this varies by community. It is not the same in every state. Some prisons are non-operated by state government or federal government. They are privatized. Garbage collection is done that way as well. We talked about hyperpluralism, pluralism, and hierarchy of power in Chapter 1, and I'm going to go back to Max Weber's model, and this is what bureaucracy is based on. Characteristics of bureaucracy. Again, hierarchical authority structure. There is a chain of command. In a bureaucracy, we have people who are specialized in a certain task. So that means we have a division of labor. That is a very common characteristic of any bureaucratic society. We have extensive rules, which are policies for the organization to follow. There are clear goals. Every cabinet level department, every agency has clear guidelines which they must follow. We operate by the merit principle. Hiring and promotion is based on quality. There are no jobs for favors. Technically, you're not supposed to give a job if you owe somebody a favor. We operate on the merit principle, where if you have if you qualify for the job, then you get the job. Impersonality. Performance is judged on productivity. How well you do your job is how you are evaluated. And you can think, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Some people criticize Weber's model and want different things, but this is how the United States bureaucracy is set up. This is the last portion that I want to go over before we go to the history, and then I'll cut this one a little short. Bureaucratic organization. Again, this slide is very important, and the next couple things I'm going to say, because this is the heart of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is composed of specialized experts. Even though they're citizens, they do carry out the law. Look at this statement right here. They interpret broad policy by Congress. Congress at times is intentionally vague, and when they give that law or policy to the executive branch, it's the bureaucrats who get to translate and clarify the details. So please make sure you understand the power of the executive branch in carrying out and interpreting the law. Sometimes the bureaucracy might decide a law, and then the Supreme Court has to settle congressional intent versus how the executive branch carries it out. And I'll talk about that a little more later. Bureaucrats are not subject to political pressure. They are not up for re-election. Many bureaucrats spend their days working for the government, but it's the chairs and the secretaries of the departments who usually come and go more frequently. They have freedom to interpret policy as they see fit, and it's very hard to fire a bureaucrat. There's a lot of different steps that you have to take, so they are protected. I do want you to look at point number 3. For certain jobs in the bureaucracy, such as if you are going to be Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, if you are going to lead an agency like the Central Intelligence Agency, departments and agencies have to be appointed by the president, and then in many cases, some need consent of the Senate. So I want you to know that that is a check and balance. The president can't just put anybody in. You have to have approval by the Senate. I think you can read over this slide. This was historically, since 1932, with many of the New Deal programs, and again in 1968, the federal government role has increased. And with that increase in government policy and an activist government, there are more laws, and therefore you need more bureaucrats to interpret and carry out the law or policy. So this says initially policies were regulating markets such as the securities industry, labor, agriculture products. If you remember when we talked about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and then we looked at Food Inc., which is one of those other ones. Every time you get the meat, it says USDA approved. That's bureaucracy. We know that the government is looking for meat products to make sure that they're safe. The intent of the government originally was to correct market imperfections or to provide the public with a service. And I really do think that this one, providing the public with services, is what the intent of many national laws are. They get passed on to the bureaucracy to implement. Agencies were developed to help with the demand of these laws. When the government makes laws, you have to have somebody carry out. So agencies were developed to help with the demand. Today, it is very normal for federal policy to be monitored by agencies. And sometimes agencies are located in state and local governments, and they are given federal money, or the states might give them money too. A great example is the Environmental Protection Agency. You will have those all over. OSHA is another one. A lot of these alphabet agencies exist. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they are there to help provide for public safety. I think these are some of the things that we can wrap up. It's organized hierarchically. That's called the Weber model, Max Weber. The head of the political bureau is the political appointee of the president's choosing. In most cases, a head of a bureau, which is a department or agency, is normally appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. If you look at some of the terminology here with the history of the civil service, remember I said originally that today we go based on merit, that people are hired because they are qualified for the job. Historically, that wasn't always the case. I'm sure many of you remember studying President Jackson. Andrew Jackson was one of the first ones who started the practice of patronage, where if he had a political supporter donate money or he owed them a favor, he would give them a federal job in an agency or in the bureaucracy, and many times it would be well paid and it's a lifelong job. So he encouraged that practice. Friends and supporters were selected to an agency post regardless of their competence, and he was really criticized for the patronage system. So anytime you hear Andrew Jackson, sometimes that's one of those patronage systems that did not work well. To counter the patronage system, this is in 1883, there are several historical acts that I need you to know. The Pendleton and Hatch Acts are going to be ones that we will mention. The Pendleton Act of 1883 formed the basis for personnel policies of the national government. This said it has to be based on merit, not patronage. So if you can remember the P in Pendleton, patronage was stopped by the Pendleton Act, and it was a direct result of the assassination of President Garfield. A disgruntled employee was angry at President Garfield for some of his policies, so he went after him, thus assassinating him. So they had a policy put in place that ended Jacksonian spoils. I do want you to notice this word. Patronage or patronage is often called the spoils system. And so that was put to rest by the Pendleton Act. Another act to help ensure the accuracy or the fairness of the bureaucratic appointees and employees is called the Hatch Act, and this was 50 years later, 1939. It prohibited political parties from pressuring their employees or a federal employee to make contributions or actively participate for one candidate in order to keep their job. So some agencies were putting pressure on their employees that they had to vote a certain way or else they would not have their job. And in a sense, they have been regulated since then from lobbying for or against a candidate on the job. So that was called the Hatch Act in 1939. The real one that has caused probably the most reorganization is the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. This was a major reform of the civil service system. Two things, and look at these two right here. When you often hear of people working in the executive branch, it is managed through the OPM. It's called the Office of Personnel Management and the Merit Systems Protection Board. If you look up both of those organizations, it's really interesting to see what they do. But if any of you work for the federal government one day, you might have to go through a system from the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. It encourages efficiency, accountability for agency performance, exposure of fraud, abuse, corruption, and it safeguards employees. So this is one of those things that they did to ensure that federal government employees were being treated fairly and honestly by their employer. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. This is the first one. What we did, we went through the definition of bureaucracy, characteristics of the bureaucracy, and a little bit of history regarding the bureaucracy.